There are days, this is one of them, when you wonder what your role is in this country and what your future is in it. Mm-hmm. How precisely you're going to reconcile yourself to your situation here, and how you're going to communicate to the vast, heedless, unthinking, cruel white majority that you are here. I'm terrified at the moral apathy, the death of the heart, which is happening in my country. These people have deluded themselves for so long that they really don't think I'm human. I base this on their conduct, not on what they say. And this means that they have become, in themselves, moral monsters.
Hi there, Jamie here with Annapolis Discovered, and today we're here in downtown Annapolis, just off Church Circle, visiting the Banneker-Douglass Museum. Just off the lobby is this wonderful room that we're in today that features rotating exhibits. The current exhibit features the Honorable Verda Welcome, a lady we're going to learn a little bit more about when we meet with Chanel Compton, the Executive Director here at the museum. Thanks so much, Chanel, for having us here. Now, I understand you probably spend a lot of time here at the museum, but you're also a part of something that's happening, a big 50th anniversary celebration. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture kicked off its We Rise celebration and campaign with our We Rise Gala that took place right here at the Banneker-Douglass Museum. We had an award ceremony where we celebrated African Americans who have actively preserved African American heritage through their work, through arts and activism, through journalism and media. It was a fun event, don't get me wrong, but it was really inspiring as well.
That's wonderful. Now tell me, the 50th anniversary celebration of this commission, who started this commission and what makes it so important?
So the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture was legislated in 1969, and that legislation was led by the late, great Senator Verta Freeman Welcome, who was the nation's first African-American state woman senator. She worked with Benjamin Quarles, famed historian, first African-American to write about Frederick Douglass. And they worked together on this legislation to create the nation's first state ethnic commission that was charged with preserving African-American history and culture and being authentic in presenting African-American history and culture as a way to combat racism, oppression, and also to celebrate diversity in Maryland. So how can you really hate someone if you know their history and culture? How can you really feel disempowered if you know you stand on the shoulders of greats? So with this 50th anniversary, we're reflecting on all of our accomplishments, but we're also looking for the next 50 years and ahead, and how we can provide resources to better preserve heritage in the great state of Maryland.
And one of the ways that you do that is telling stories. A lot of those stories are told right here in the Banneker-Douglass Museum.
Yeah, so the Banneker-Douglass Museum is the state's official museum on African American history and culture.
If you've never been, you should come.
Definitely.
If you've been here, you should come, because there's even more new things to see and experience.
Exactly, and you know, we're excited. You know, this space is, of course, is a magical space because it preserves history and culture, but it's also an active space because this is a venue that facilitates open dialogue around anti-racism, around diversity and inclusion, around community building. So what better place to do all that but your state's museum?
Thank you so much again for having us here in this wonderful place. I know that I've enjoyed coming here and bringing my daughters, and I can't wait to bring them back. There's so many things to look forward to as we learn and grow.
Together.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Here we are in the historical wing of the Banneker-Douglass Museum, located in what used to be the original Mount Moriah AME Church. It's been a pleasure today learning about all the wonderful things that the Banneker-Douglass Museum and the Maryland Commission has to offer. You can learn more and see how you can get involved in the Banneker-Douglass Museum Foundation in our written blog. I'm Jamie with Annapolis Discovered, and I'll see you on our next adventure.
Welcome to the Banneker-Douglass Museum. My name is Sabria Hassan, and I am the Director of Programs here at the museum. It's so nice to see you all here today for a special program titled Death of the Heart, an artist talk brought to you by Jason Patterson. So today we'll be talking about stories of white supremacy, Black resistance, and contextualizing our history, and what more relevant and just a relevant time to be talking about resistance. You know, something that seems like was so long ago, but here we are today talking about the same issues. I wanted to, before we get started, welcome our phenomenal executive director. She's standing in the back. She's so humble. We're so happy to have her here, Director Chanel Johnson. And then also in the room, I see another phenomenal person, our director of our commission, Dr. Edward Johnson, no relation, but just as amazing in the back, giving a fist bump. We can give him a round of applause as well. This artist talk goes along with our current exhibit, Revisit, Reimagine, and we have our special guest, curator, also here, Mr. Thomas James. You want us to And we'll hear more from Thomas later on in the program. But we'll get started, and I'll tell you a little bit about Jason. So Jason Patterson's work focuses on African American history and highlights the role the past has in cultivating our current political and social conditions in the United States. Patterson's practice is heavily research-based, with the majority of his studio time dedicated to that research to ensure that the historical and social narratives presented are well represented. Patterson makes his physical work through soft pastels, portraiture, woodworking, and the recreation or reimagining of historical documents. Patterson's figurative work is based on archived images. This work investigates the different ways images in those varying forms structure the way we visually comprehend our history and define our present. Patterson is currently a board member of the Kent Cultural Alliance and a fellow with the Chesapeake Heartland, an African American humanities project. And Jason also is featured in our current exhibit, Revisit Reimagine. So without further ado, I will hand the mic over to Jason.
Hello. Thank you all for coming. So today I'm going to give you a little talk about the work that I do. Is it working? Is the mic good? All right. This first slide that you're looking at here is, as you can tell, if you see my work, you can certainly see the work here, is very different than the other work that I do. But I usually start my talks out with this image because it is really a fundamental way to sort of explain the work that I'm trying to do. And the fundamental thing that I'm trying to do with my artwork is contextualize our past to better understand our present. When I do the research and I do the work that I do, one of the things that I've always noticed, especially when I'm pouring into this stuff more than an average person, is how much important information and important history that I'm learning that really explain our country and our culture and our society today that aren't commonly known. And so a focus of mine is to really show those things in artistic ways. And I had this idea, this piece is called Timeline, to do it in the most minimalistic way, 3 tapestries. But the specific thing that I wanted to show was the fact that people don't really realize the scope of African American presence in what's now the United States. So I thought, why don't I divide the sort of fundamental conditions of African Americans into 3 sections and use sort of a physical way to represent that time. So I thought of these tapestries. Each of these tapestries, what they represent is a year if every year is an inch. And those years are representing enslavement, Jim Crow apartheid, and the country since the Civil Rights era. So the last Civil Rights Act was 1968. So if we use 1619 as a starting point, which can be debatable. I made this piece in 2016 and I might debate that starting point. But if we use that as a starting point and we ended in 1865, that's about 250 years. So if you go by inches, it's about 20 feet long. If we go by the Jim Crow era, if we use 1865 to 1968, that's about 8 feet. And since then is about, which was at the time was 2016, so that's about almost exactly 4 feet. So the idea was to really represent, like, that's how much time the African American condition was essentially slavery, and that's how much time it was apartheid. And then that's how little amount of time it's been since those time periods. So the goal was to really show people, contextualize time in our condition. But the majority of the work that I do is portraiture. There's sort of 3 aspects to the work that I do. It's portraiture, frame building, designing and building frames for those portraits, and then reformatting or even verbatim recreating historical documents that have historic context with what I've tried to do. What I'm showing you now are some portraits of sort of the general idea of portraiture that I do. How I do this is, it's kind of a style of drawing that I've developed myself. It's soft pastel, so chalk pastels on raw canvas. Here's a portrait of Lincoln in progress. You can see the pastels were on the canvas, but here is an example of those pastels. It's actually the Chestertown protest piece that's in this show here. These are the pastels that I used for that piece. And you can see that piece had a lot of color. When I first started developing this style of drawing, which was about almost 20 years ago, I only did white pastel and charcoal. I didn't really have a lot of experience with pastel, and I didn't think that I could do color. But when I made this piece, still from the Rodney King video, I was like, well, let me try color. I mean, it's already muddy. And the idea I had was, I thought, well, I can't control the color. It's too much dust, and it'll just get muddy, but this is already muddy. But when I worked on this piece, I did this in 2011, it was actually pretty easy to control the color. So I was like, oh, I guess I'm gonna start doing color. And you can see I've been doing a lot of color since then. When I use that pastel, I have to use layers and layers of spray fixative. When you spray dry pastel, it gets darker. So when I do these projects, I create these palettes, so I can kind of keep in mind the colors I'm using and what they'll be using. So for this piece, the pastel on the chart on this side is the palette that I used for that. And then here is a video of that drawing when it was complete. When I finish the work, what I do is cover it with a clear acrylic. And this is a video of that acrylic drying on the canvas. You can kind of see those little blue highlights as the acrylic not dried just yet. But that's sort of the process of the portraits that I do. One of the main things that I try to focus on in the images that I choose is, again, like I mentioned before, I'm trying to contextualize our history. Often the history that we know isn't exactly contextualized correctly, at least in my opinion. One of the things that, for these two pieces, so these are portraits of Fred Hampton, the leader of the Black Panthers in Chicago, and Rosa Parks. With Fred Hampton, I think not many people know who Fred Hampton is. I think he's recently getting more of acknowledgement, but the main thing I don't think people understand is how young he was when he was killed by the police and the FBI. He was 21 years old, and he was leading the Black Panthers in a major city. He was doing it in a unique way from other chapters of the Black Panthers, where he was working with other racial radical groups and really focusing on poverty and capitalism and bringing everybody in, not just the Black community, although the Black Panthers are doing an immense amount of work for the Black community in Chicago. And this image is his senior high school yearbook picture that I really think is interesting. It also looks very different from the radical Black Panther he would have become just a few years later. The Rosa Parks piece is important because I think even more, I mean, people talk a lot about how King's legacy and the way we remember him is very sanitized. I can't stress how much more Rosa Parks is. Rosa Parks was an important NAACP figure in Alabama well before the bus boycott. She did immense, important work before the boycott. And we don't really think of her as the organizing activist that she actually was. The other point about Parks that I'm trying to make with this piece is the fact that after the bus boycott, she had to move to Detroit. Rosa Parks lived in Detroit the majority of her life. And we don't talk about how her and her husband couldn't live in the South after that because of the notoriety that she got and because no one would hire her, the harassment. So she had to live in Detroit most of her life. This image is of her in, I believe, 1968. And it's actually a cropped image of her and Shirley Chisholm, the Congresswoman. So, other aspect of the work that I do, I just turn these images, but what I'm going to talk about is the frames. When I make these frames, I'm trying to I'm designing them myself, but I'm trying to emulate the time period they're from. These images are from the 1960s. When I'm thinking of sort of mid-century modern, more minimalist things, I think for these, I'm thinking just more simple shadow box frames with a metal leaf on the inside. To me, I'm thinking like, what if these were hanging in a building in the mid-60s? How would they look if I was following the sort of the design styles of that time? And that's where I came with these simplified frames. Now, most of my frames, especially when we get into the 19th century, are very ornate, like these two. I use wood molding. You can see in this one has this one on the left has paper, decorative paper, but I really try to still building my own design, but still think about the time period that these came from, and try to use ideas from those places. But you know, the whole idea with these frames to me is to bring the viewer into the work more, really literally, figuratively frame that artwork in the era that it's happening in. So this image here is the Henry Highland Garnett piece that you saw with the clear acrylic drying on. This is the in-progress view of that frame. It eventually looked like this. A lot of staining, more molding, a lot more work was put into it. And this is what it looked like in the space that it ended up in. So lastly is I recreate historic documents, whether it's completely designing them myself, with the formatting. Often the work is, almost always there'll be real text in it, but how it's formatted, and if it's just real text, some of it might be my text, that's in it. This is the document that I'll get back to in a second, that this goes with the Henry Highland Garnett portrait. This is I think this might be the first document that I made to go with a piece. I did this in 2015. It is the formatting of a legal document, but all the text, at least those two paragraphs, are the basically my artist statement for this diptych about Malcolm X, about him at the Queens County Court when the Nation of Islam, after he left, tried to repossess his house. I loved these stills from the film, and so I wanted to create a document that really fit the time period, the context of the story, and everything, and put my words into it that way. I don't usually use the documents as a vehicle for the artist statement. With the Garnett piece, which we'll get back to, it's a little bit of that, but there's still a real quote related to that. Here is an example of something that I created verbatim. When I was a visiting artist at Temple, I went into their African American archive, found a first edition of the Underground Railroad, and William Still's Underground Railroad, and I had never looked at it before, and I didn't realize all it is he would bring these people on the Underground Railroad into his home in Philadelphia, ask them to tell their story. He recorded their name and where they're from and put it into the book. So it's like the first thing I thought was, well, is there anybody from Kent County? And so I went to the Kent County, and what was really special about this is not just Kent County, it's one of the few stories that actually has an illustration. So I turned that into some work that I did about the history of Kent County, Maryland, and the history of Washington College, which I'll get into later in this talk. So going back to that Garnett piece, when I'm making work or making these documents, I'm looking at old documents, getting ideas. For the Garnett piece, I wanted text to talk about Garnett with his own words, but as well as sort of highlight this work's commission. So this is some of the things that I was looking at. On the left is that image is the seal of Liberia, where Garnett lived the end of his life. And on the left, even though Garnett is from Kent County, he grew up most of his life in New York City. And that's an early seal of New York City. In the center there is the Kent County seal. And then on the right here is an article that was talking about what Garnett had to say about about John Brown, which is what I wanted to put into the document. It actually, because he refers to Washington, which I'll get into later. But again, other stuff like this, the typeface of history, or the font that I'm using, and that Maryland stuff, just getting ideas of how I want things to look. So on the right here is just all the text that's going to be in that document. It was when I'm working on this, I mean, I can't design and write at the same time. So really, I just put it into a Word document. And then on the right here, or on the left here, is the first stages of designing it, really early on, really minimal. At the bottom of the sheet is this sort of like illustration that I put together from different illustrations. It has the Liberian seal, it has that New York seal, it has the shield the Kent County seal is based on. And then it says his birth year in Chesterville, which is what the town he was born in Kent County is called now. Not to be confused with Chestertown, it's right outside of Chestertown. And then Monrovia, which is the capital of Liberia, where he passed away. And then the banner at the top is the motto of Liberia. And then this is what the document looked like. Again, using design aspects from the late 19th century to create this. One of the things I should mention that I haven't talked about before, the paper I use is often old paper. It's paper from old books. If you get old books, all books have blank sheets, and I remove the blank sheets from the paper, or from those books, and that's what I print on. Interestingly enough, he died in 1882. The book that this page came from was published in 1882, so it was, it felt like it was meant to happen. Specifically, that text that's in the red box is Garnett making the argument for John Brown after Harper's Ferry. He's making the argument to say, if John Brown was wrong, then so was Washington to do the revolution. And the reason why I wanted to find him referencing, I wanted to just find him referencing Washington. It was such a gift that he's actually talking about John Brown in that reference. But the reason why is because he's facing, in Whitehall, the home where this is at, he's facing George Washington. So that's why I was very excited about using that quote. So yeah, this is a historic home in Chestertown called Whitehall. The owners of the home had commissioned me to do this Garnett piece. Well, they commissioned me they asked me, they wanted to do work for the house, and I said, how about I do this Garnett piece, this Henry Highland Garnett piece, and they were into it. Okay, so that's basically how I make the work that I make. Those are the aspects of it. For this next part, I'm going to talk about how kind of think about things, and I'll be a little bit focused on how I'm thinking about things now with the current events in the world and things. But one of the things that I think is really important is understanding history. You know, there's that cliched history repeating itself, and it's an obnoxious term, but I mean, it's true. And it's fine if history repeats itself. What's bad is when we don't recognize the repetition. And particularly now, I see it so much, and it's a little heartbreaking because it's not just that people aren't seeing the repetition. It feels like people with power, institutions, the government, probably are seeing it and know how to manipulate people who aren't seeing it. And I think that that's not good. So another part, and these are related, but I'm going to talk about these two things around the same time, is when we think about the past, often, especially for those of us who didn't live it, so much context is lost, particularly with the civil rights era and how unpopular it was. We don't really think about this. So this is a Gallup poll of asking white Americans what they think about demonstrations and sit-ins, and the overwhelming majority, or not overwhelming, the majority, the solid majority, just disapproved of those things. So now I'm going to show some parallels as the subtitle for this show, sort of talks about parallels from the past and today in some video with you right here.
You can never whip these buds if you don't keep you in that center. I found that out, buddy. You've got to keep the white, the black center.
So the next clip I'm going to show is a tactic that in Birmingham, what Bull Connor and the city officials used to try to suppress protests.
Bull Connor and the segregation of politicians get an injunction against marching. Once you issue an injunction, violating that injunction automatically send you to jail. And your sentence can be pretty arbitrary, and it's up to the judge.
With the injunction in place, Bull Connor skyrockets bail amounts for protesters, draining organizers' funds so fast that they can't keep their promise to bail anyone out quickly.
So Bull Connor in the 60s is basically making what should be a First Amendment right, finding a way to make it illegal. So we can fast forward to about 3 years ago and see, and this is, you know, the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, and see what politicians in 2021 were doing in southern states.
We're not going to let the mob win the day in that.
Our response to injustices in this country is protest. But their response is to criminalize it when the recourse for us is to turn to the streets to make our voices heard in this unjust system. Let Governor DeSantis know that you have just declared war on the First Amendment in the state of Florida.
The question becomes, who's determining what's peaceful or not? Who's making the determination? Oh, this bill is not only unconstitutional, it's vague and overbroad.
So you have that correlation where it's the government is trying to stop people doing something that should be a First Amendment right. So this next clip is what I'm going to do. What I'm using it for again is to create the parallels of how law enforcement treats protests from the 60s and to the present.
On May 2nd, 1963, Black children who were trained in nonviolent tactics walked out of their classes and assembled at the 16th Street Baptist Church to march to downtown Birmingham. More than 700 children protesting racial segregation were arrested, blasted with fire hoses, clubbed by police, and attacked by police dogs. On May 3rd, 1963, hundreds more children began to march. Commissioner of Public Safety Eugene Bull Connor ordered police and firemen to attack the children with high-pressure hoses, batons, and police dogs. Images of the children being brutally assaulted by the police appeared on television and in newspapers across the country and world, provoking global outrage.
So that was a big deal in the 60s, in the early 60s, to see children being treated that way. The thing that's really I've noticed more recently is we know what happened then. We know how we think about those law enforcement treating protesters that way. But then when we fast forward to 2022, the treatment is almost, or 2024, the treatment is almost identical.
Tensions are high on many campuses. Armed state troopers were on campus at the University of Texas at Austin during a protest there, and dramatic video shows the moment a news photographer covering the event was tackled to the ground by police. Now, Fox 7 reporters in Austin say the cameraman is a part of their news team. The photographer was arrested and taken to jail. The Palestinian Solidarity Committee of Austin planned to march to the school's South Lawn, where they would occupy the area for a day. And Texas Governor Greg Abbott confirmed more than 20 arrests were made on campus in Austin.
So this next video, I mean, what I've really noticed in it is the language that's used by the authorities over a loudspeaker, and then again, just the way they advance on the crowd. So we can go back to 1963, and crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And usually when you watch this, there isn't audio, but this one does have audio. So for me, there's a lot of things that I take away from that, comparing what's happening now to the footage back then. You know, you can get into, like, to me, you can and you should get into talking about the parallels between the social and political reasonings for the protests now and the protests then. But the way I'm thinking about it, I'm not even there yet, because to me, what stands out the most is how similar the tactics are. I mean, collectively, like I mentioned before, we treat what happened to protesters in the 1960s as wrong and not what should have been done. But it seems like there's no hesitation to do the exact same thing now, and that's interesting to me. Even with the language of the police on the loudspeaker saying the same thing, using the same tactics is interesting. Is not the best word to me, but it stands out. The other thing with what I learned from this video, and especially with the audio, and you can hear it better in a different clip, but I didn't even put in this because it's kind of troubling, is you can kind of hear most of the yelling you hear are the marchers in this, but going back to what I was saying about how we don't really remember how unpopular this movement was, is certainly in the local areas it was happening. In other videos from other angles in this, you can hear the street is lined by white onlookers, and it's impressive how loud the cheering is, where they're cheering because the police are trampling this crowd, and it's pretty disturbing. But again, I think that context is important. I think we need to know these things. So, similar to what I was talking about, a couple years ago, I wrote an article in Southern Cultures, which is an academic journal at University of North Carolina, with Lauren Frances Adams, who is a Baltimore artist, and our work is very similar. Her work is from a white perspective, though, but it was pretty much a conversation between each other that we transcribed. But the point that I made, and this is related to the point I just made now, is that we don't if you go back to that timeline piece that I showed you all, this notion I think we have too much, or we don't think about this enough, is that you had almost 400 years of fundamental white supremacy before the 1960s. Like, it is a normal thing. It has been going on for centuries. The opposite of it is difficult for people to even comprehend, black and white. So there's this national assumption that after the 1960s, everybody who believed in that, who were raised on it, their grandparents believed in it, their great-grandparents, their ancestors believed in it, all stopped thinking it, all stopped believing in white supremacy, believing in segregation. I don't think that happened. When enslavement ended, it evolved into apartheid for a century. Why should we assume that over the past 60 years that it hasn't evolved into something else? I mean, the things on the surface is mass incarceration and other ways of sustaining a racial hierarchy. And so that's what the point that I tried to make in this article. I left a QR code there. The article actually is free, that you can read it. Lauren's amazing. I think it was a great conversation that we had between each other. So another piece that I did, our project that I did, that actually isn't finished, but I'm really glad that I got to start doing it. It was a visiting artist trip to the University of Arkansas. It was through the printmaking department, so I was making prints. I wasn't physically making prints, which was fun. I got to just think stuff, and the grad students and undergrads and professors were working on it. And we didn't finish the prints, but we got the project going, and it was really great. But I'm really interested in is like symbols, and there are still several states in the United States that have flags that honor the Confederacy. This is one of them. This isn't just one of them. This is the Confederate flag. I think when we think about the Confederate flag, we think of the blue cross on a red field with the white stars, which is the battle flag for the Army of Northern Virginia. But this was the equivalent of the American flag. This is Georgia's flag now. They just added their seal to the Confederate flag. It boggles my mind that this is not an important thing. It was very strange to me to see Raphael Warnock become a senator and have this behind him. It's just troubling for me. So that's something that I think I plan on making more work about Georgia's flag. When I was there in Arkansas, I made work about Arkansas's flag. So Arkansas's flag, this is the bottom one or actually it doesn't look like either of these now. But so the one on the top was the first official flag of Arkansas. It was put in place by this guy, Neil Bollinger. He was a state congressman and a Klansman, open Klansman. During the early 1920s, it's the Klan had incredible political power. The stars that are represented in the white field, those blue stars, are represented the countries that represented the what Arkansas was a territory of. So it was France, Spain, United States. Year later, he wanted to add another star to represent the Confederacy, so they added that star. After that, they decided, well, no, we actually want to put the Confederate star at the top above Arkansas. And this is Arkansas's flag now. This is what he said about honoring the Confederates. But now in Arkansas, the flag, it specifically honors the Confederacy over the United States, France, and Spain. There's been, in my understanding, there's been two, maybe three, but I think two attempts in Arkansas's state legislature to change this. One was get rid of that star completely. The other one was to just change the meaning to go back to the four-corner version and have one star not represent the Confederacy, but be a reference to the indigenous population of Arkansas. None of them even got past their committee. There wasn't even, nothing happened. And especially with the political scene in Arkansas now, this will never, I don't see this changing anytime soon. So the project that I worked on is making prints of this, where it's really just straightforward explaining this. I'm not, to me, this stuff is more important than me making some beautiful, aesthetically pleasing artwork. I do think this is aesthetically pleasing, but it's so important to me to just be, the text on all of this just explains this absurd existence of this flag. And this is some of the prints that the students and faculty at University of Arkansas made. It was a really great experience. So now I'm going to talk to you about the project that I did at Washington College, where I work and I live in Chestertown, where Washington College is. I did this project. It finished in 2020. The bad news was we were in a pandemic, so there was no opening. The good news is the college could afford then to hire a professional photographer to take amazing images of it. But the work is about the Black history of Kent County and Washington College, and about the history of white supremacy in both within the county's community and the college's community. One of the first pieces I did with it was this article or this sort of this ad in local newspaper in I think 1845, is that right? Of a share sale of a man whose property was possessed because he owed debts. Some of those debts were to Washington College. Of what was being auctioned were some of the things that were being auctioned were black children. So what this posting represents is a direct evidence of Washington College profiting off of slavery. Of course, Washington College profits off slavery is founded by slave owners, but this is like the direct acknowledgement of it in print. So I recreated that ad. When I started this project, and I thought, well, this was actually around where a lot of people were getting in trouble for finding old images of blackface. And I was like, well, did that happen at Washington College? I bet it did. Where should I start looking? And so I started looking in the Kappa Alpha fraternity section of the yearbooks, and it took about 5 minutes. If you know the history of the Kappa Alphas, is they were founded at Washington and Lee when it was just also unrelated, but also called Washington College, while Robert E. Lee was the president of the college. Later, they added his name to it. But it is a fraternity that really sort of lionized him and idolized him, and they still do. And in the past, they really went hard with sort of the lost cause, sort of like glorifying the Old South. More recently, if you remember, I think it was students from the University of Louisiana who went to the Emmett Till sign and shot it up and posed in front of it. Those were Kappa Alpha members. So this image on the left is the Kappa Alphas pretending to do a black church service at on Washington College's stage. This was in 1957. What's very interesting, and it's a little side note, so it's Doug Gates, who was a sophomore at the time, and being, I guess, naive and kind of ageist, when I made this, was like, well, of course he's not still alive. Doug Gates is still alive, and he lives in Chestertown. I didn't talk to him. It was during the pandemic. He's very old, and I was in the middle of the project, and I couldn't. I wasn't going to add anything he had to say to the project, but the college had known I was making this. They reached out to him. According to the administrator who reached out to him, they explained the project I was doing, and before they said what I was about Black history, he's like, "Oh, you found the yearbook." And a colleague of mine, Pat Nugent, who's a historian, he did have a conversation with him over the phone. He said it was really interesting. He said he is very embarrassed by it. He knows it's wrong, and he's very embarrassed, and he feels horrible about it. But the thing he made a point of, and I thought was very interesting, he's like, I'm not making excuses for myself. What I did was wrong, and I chose to do it. But I think as a young 19 or 20-year-old, no one at a college was telling me I was doing anything wrong. No students, no faculty, no staff. He thought what he was doing was fine. This is 1957. It's a long time ago, but it's not. Other colleges weren't doing this. What's really, really interesting, and what is kind of an honor to be able to put this in the show, that tapestry in the middle is not mine. It was a painting that was in the college's library until the 70s. And it is about the title of it is something like Governor Paca lays the cornerstone of Washington College during its founding. Governor Paca isn't doing anything in the image, it's an enslaved man. But what's interesting about this painting is that it was painted in the 1930s, I think 1939. And I've had so many conversations about this with historians and people trying to understand why an enslaved man is the focal point of this painting. The president at the time asked the artist to follow William Smith, the guy in the black robe, founder of the college, founder of Penn in Philadelphia, follow what Penn wrote about that event. Penn doesn't mention enslaved people, servants, or anything, but the artist chose to add an enslaved person there. That doesn't, because Penn or because Smith didn't mention it doesn't mean they weren't there, but it's strange to add that person. Now this is sort of in the WPA era. This is in like white liberal progressive thinking, and it could be that this painter thought this was like a good way of honoring African Americans in a naive way, which I guess could be possible. He also could have just been trying to reiterate white supremacy. And if in the climate in the late 1930s at Washington College, it would be fair to kind of lean that way, but it's still a interesting painting and a bizarre painting. But as a historical artifact, it's important. One of the projects that I did with this was do drawings of the first 3 African-American graduates of Washington College. Now, Washington College is the first American college, as in the first college to be founded in the United States after the Revolution. So there's a handful of colleges older, but they were founded when we were still colonies. This Washington College was founded in 1782, its first American college, also the first secular American college. Thomas Morris here was the first African-American graduate, and you can see the year he graduated was 1962. That means it took the college 180 years for an African-American to graduate from it, and that can only be by design. Kent County has always had a robust African-American community. Kent County is an hour and a half from DC, an hour and a half from Baltimore, and an hour and a half from Philadelphia. There's not a shortage of African Americans to enroll in this school. So it was by design. And I could go on and on about the early years of that from people who were there that I've talked to about that time period. This is Patricia Godbolt, who's the second graduate and the first woman, and then Dale Patterson, who I'm not related to. And she was the third graduate and also the first African-American to be on Washington College's board. It's also interesting is all 3 of these graduates spent their careers in education, and we're all pretty extraordinary people. So, last things I'm going to talk about are the pieces that are here. So this is the piece. If you were here earlier, you saw the footage of the 8mm film of a protest in Chestertown. It was a coordinated effort that was of civil rights organizations protesting across the Eastern Shore and organizing them. This was focused on Bud's Restaurant, which, if you've been to Chestertown, is right by where the Royal Farms is now. There's a funeral home where Bud's Restaurant stood. But Bud's in 1962 was still segregated, so it was being picketed. I won't go. We're going to talk about this later after the intermission a lot more, so I'm not going to go into it too much. But this was a fun project, and it was really important to me to, the community that I live in have such an important artifact that shows the history. Where there are buildings in this video that I drive by every day, and it was just really an honor to make it. Going back to how people thought about these movements back then, that headline from the Washington College's newspaper isn't very nice, to say the least. And the article is very cold. It's really just if you read it, it's really just a timeline of the events. And it seems like the writer really wanted to be more condescending than he was, but it's a cold article in a very biased headline. So the last piece, or the second piece that I have here, is about Gloria Richardson. I think more people know this photo than know who Gloria Richardson is. Gloria Richardson was a activist, civil rights activist in Cambridge, Maryland. She was, I guess you could call her the de facto leader of the, I'm going to forget the CNEC, her organization. It'll be in a slide in a second. But so why I did this piece about Gloria Richardson, obviously because she's from Maryland. I mean, this is really important history. It's not just Maryland, but the Eastern Shore of Maryland. And I can't stress, I'm going to try, but I can't stress enough about how important her work was in such a limited time. I mean, her main activism was just 1963. I mean, she went into 64 and 65 a little bit, but it was really this. What's really special about her is that she, let me go back. She was from a wealthy family, really old African-American family that had that was well-to-do, but she chose to focus on the plight of African-Americans, particularly in where she lived in Maryland. Her organization specifically was very minimal when it came to hierarchy. She was not really technically the leader. Everything was democratic, everything was voted on. Because of the type of person she was usually in the forefront, but what her organization really did was lay, and herself, in the choices she made and the tactics that she used, lay out a template for the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers, the sort of post, like, clergy civil rights era of groups of activists. And then this, so as you all may know, one of Malcolm X's most famous speeches was in Detroit, and it was Message to the Grassroots, and this is from that speech. So Malcolm X, I think, was the first person to really have enough attention to highlight what Gloria Richardson and other activists were doing that King and other more notable activists weren't doing. Was everything was local. It was focused on you worry about what's happening in your community, because that's the way to be most effective. And that's essentially what the Black Panthers took on towards the end of the 60s and into the 70s. But Gloria Richardson was probably the most significant. Her and her movement were really significant in sort of pioneering that way. And Malcolm X noticed and mentioned her in one of his most famous speeches. And you can see her with Malcolm, with Dick Gregory, and then in the image on the right, she's with Bobby Kennedy when he was still the Attorney General. What's really interesting, and again, it's her unique way of activism for the time, unique, was Bobby Kennedy and him and his brother sort of like liberal, well-meaning way of thinking thought, well, we think segregation is bad, but what you should do is just vote on it. And he's talking about the Cambridge voting on whether or not they should stay segregated. And Gloria Richardson responds like, why should we vote or let other people vote on our rights? So she encouraged the Black community to boycott the vote. And so she had a very different way of looking at things. She was supposed to speak at the March on Washington, but at the last minute they stopped her from speaking. And she thinks it's because she says this, that she would have had them say, you should start doing sit-ins in Washington. We shouldn't be just speaking, we should be doing this activist work. I could go on and on about Richardson. So, like I've been talking about, one of the main things that I do is I try to find historic documents that will accompany the work. When I was looking at, like, working on her and looking at specifically that's the title, Cambridge Nonviolence Action Committee was her organization. This is a report, so their biggest demonstrations and what the image is from and what her pushing the bayonet out of the way is from is the activism they're doing in the summer of 1963. And at the end of that year, or I guess in the fall, her organization, and I think probably mostly her, wrote a report about what happened. But what's interesting about this report is it's beautifully printed, but it starts with a history of Cambridge and talks about the Black condition in Cambridge up to 1963. Oh no. Sorry. One of just the hand-drawn graphs and maps and things are really interesting. I certainly plan on making work about this in the future. But what I did do for this piece is I didn't recreate a document, but I put this quote on the canvas. Why I put this quote, I mean, it's a great quote, and it's important, and it's kind of what I was alluding to earlier, but what really hit me with this quote is, so I'm originally from Illinois, from central Illinois, and I've been here for 6 years. When I started learning about the local Black history on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and seeing what happened from colonial era to the present, one of the things I thought was like, you can really tell American history and just talk about the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Certainly all of Maryland, but you could do it with just the Eastern Shore. And she's talking about, I mean, she's essentially saying that about the Civil Rights era, saying how in Cambridge is what's happening everywhere. It's just that because of what we're doing is why we're getting national attention, and that Americans should understand that this is what we're going through. And so I started working on this piece, and I did it, and I made it for this show. I did not give myself enough time, but I got through it. Thinking back, it's a little triggering, thinking of how much hours I poured into it in such a short time. But this is a progress image of it. This is, on the left is a progress image of doing that text. I have experience putting text on canvas. I did this a little differently than I've done in the past, and I haven't done it in a really long time, so I'm so grateful I didn't ruin it. But that is how it ended up, and this is the piece. I think this image is amazing. I wanted to, everybody knows the bayonet image. I wanted to find something else. This is a pretty easy image to find, and I usually avoid images like that. But with this show, acknowledging the parallels of the past and today, the first thing I thought when I saw this image is the Black Lives Matter movement and hands up, don't shoot. That's not what she's referencing is she's directing the crowd that was behind her. But it still sort of calls forward to that era of activism. And so I broke the rule of not using a common image or a image that people may have seen, but I think it was important enough to use that image for this. So yeah, thank you for listening. So me and Thomas are going to do a Q&A.
Once again, Jason, thank you. That was incredible.
Thank you.
To say the least. And again, thank you all for being here. This is a program that we've been very excited about. So to have it come together and have that first part be all we hoped it would be and more is exciting. So now I have some questions that I think would be intriguing for Jason that I think you all will enjoy. My first question for you is I think you mentioned it briefly, but you are self-taught, and so I wanted to kind of ground this conversation and really your practice in investigating how you came to how your practice developed into what it is now, being self-taught. So where did this come from? Where did your interest lie beforehand, and how do we get to where you are now?
So I think for me, self-taught just means I don't have a degree. I've learned so much from people that I couldn't have learned on my own. So it isn't like I just figured this stuff out on my own. If some amazing people have helped me on my way. But how I got where I'm at now is, I mean, I've always been interested in art since I was a kid. I knew I always wanted to be an artist. At some level, when I got in my older teens, early 20s is when I really decided it. I guess it's ironic considering the work that I do. I was always very bad at school, barely graduated high school. Didn't really have things figured out when I left high school, started at community college, got good grades in art and history, and art history, but I wasn't really driven by it. I struggled to do it. I eventually drop out. I was very lucky because I worked at an art supply store. So I'm from Champaign in Urbana, Illinois, where the University of Illinois is. Worked at a locally owned art supply store. So I was able to learn a lot about art supplies, which was very helpful. It was a place that opened in the early 1970s, so it had art supplies that were still from back then. So I had a history of art supplies. At some point when we moved locations, I also got a free studio out of that. So that was really formidable in my developing myself as an artist. To me, what really got me to understand how to work and have a practice, interesting enough, was not from artists, but was from engineers. As I mentioned, where I grew up is where the University of Illinois is. It's one of the biggest engineering schools in the world. And there is a handful of people who are around my age, who are engineering students, who rented out a big house and were friends of friends, and they needed another person, so I moved in with them. And then I saw what working hard was. They worked so hard, but I thought to myself, oh, I can do that with art. I see how that structure is. And this is like about 2007. So I would have been about 23. And that was a big turning point for me. I knew I wanted to do work about history, so I read as much as I could. The internet is horrible and wonderful. And when it's wonderful is when you can reach out to historians and ask questions and get advice. And that was the start of it. And in like the late 2000s and early 2010s, some of those engineering friends also had woodworking backgrounds, so they got me to understand the basics of woodworking. And I got good at it in a way that is really self-taught, but that self-taught way was also the wrong way of doing it, in a harder way. But I was really grateful is when we moved here to Chestertown. Chestertown has a master woodworker named Robert Ortiz, and he had just welcomed me, has been a mentor over the past 6 years. I can make frames better and easier than I did before, and so he's been such a wonderful teacher, and that's really that's how I got to where I'm at now.
Okay, and but even diving a little bit deeper, your interest in particular in the African American experience, in the American experience. And sort of like the time periods that you focus on. I mean, when I was introduced to your work, it was through, I believe, a portrait of Frederick Douglass. So can you talk a little bit also about your particular interest in portraying these moments in history?
Yeah. So I think I tell this to my students I have at Washington College and any younger artists. Being an artist is hard, and so you have to love every part of it. I say, like, if there's any part of you doing that you don't love, you're not doing the right thing. And fundamentally, I've loved portraiture since I was like in grade school, and so that's fundamentally why I do portraiture. I've loved history since high school, so that's why I do history. That's fundamentally, I love those two. I love learning about history, and I love doing portraiture. So that's the foundation of it. When I'm doing these things together and having to learn more about these things, particularly African American history, I'm learning this stuff. I'm like, oh, most people don't know about this. Like, and they should. This would be so helpful if we collectively understood these things. And that's really where I was like, okay, this is what I'm doing. I was really grateful. Again, one of those roommates I had, this one was an English major and not a engineer, but my friend Julia, she's one of my best friends. She's like a sister to me, but when I first met her, I asked her out on a date. And when we were on that date, I was telling her I was an artist, and she's like, oh, my dad's a painter in Chicago. And she's like, and he does this work in history. And this is when I was trying to figure out what I was doing. And she explained what he does, and I thought, I think that's what I want to do. I didn't know it, but now I do. And his name's Don Pollock, and he's this history painter, and he does amazing work, and I know him very well now, and that helped give me a template. I mean, our work is not, I mean, when you look at our work, it doesn't look that similar, but I just followed his sort of approach to it and found my own voice, and that was really helpful. So that's really that's how I sort of found what I want to do. And now the work that I do is really formulaic. It's very structured. Like I have a specific way how I do the research, how I plan the work, and how I execute it. And that goes back to that engineering sort of influence of it. I don't really feel things out and see how it goes. I have a start to finish plan. And I've been doing that for almost 20 years.
So kind of continuing, but from a bit of a shift. So as an image maker, obviously you're very intentional about about what you create that the viewers ultimately see. And when we were talking about this event in general, or mainly about your presentation, there were portions, certain images. You kind of mentioned you mentioned in your presentation there were certain sounds that you decided to keep out of the presentation because they could potentially be triggering or traumatic and things like that. So I want to ask you, as an image maker, well, I guess the first question would be, can you just talk a little bit more about how and why you choose specific images to portray? And then I'll ask you a follow-up that a little more general, but
yeah.
That one first.
So there's a lot that goes into that. Like I mentioned in the talk, I try to find images, especially if the historic figure is well known. To me, it's like, to me as an artist, if you're making representational images, especially if you're making images from photographs, from videos, from film, there's got to be a reason for it, because those images already exist. There has to be more of a reason for it, because if I have it like with the Chestertown protest, that's a high definition 8 millimeter digitizing. You can blow that up and put it on a canvas. There has to be more of it. To me, as an artist, there needs to be more of it. There has to be, at a very conceptual level, of why you want to do these things. So for me, one of those things is, to me, the conceptual side of it is, I want the viewers to think, if he's taking the time to make this image, it must be important. Like, why would you do that? Why would you do something you could just print out? Why would you draw it if it's not really important? And that's one of the reasons. I could keep going on that. But aesthetically, I think about, well, how will this look? Like, is it a compelling image? Will it translate to the way that I draw? Some images look great, but if I tried to draw them, it would that transition from a daguerreotype, a tintype, a digital photo, a film photograph to a drawing. Sometimes it translates amazing. Sometimes it's like, that's actually not going to work. So I had to consider those sides of it too. But it is a balance of all of these different things. Like, aesthetically, what does it look like? What does it say? Is it saying anything about that person in that image? What year is it? Like with the Rosa Parks image, like that's from 1968. This is after she was out of the public eye. There's a lot, but those are some of the things that I think about.
So then, kind of keeping that in mind, what are some things that, or I guess, why do you, or might you keep certain things out of an image or a presentation?
So I guess going back to when I mentioned that I didn't put the sound in that that video of our film of Bloody Sunday, I think, and this is something I added to my practice not that long ago. To me, it's really important to think about trauma and think about how people will perceive things, especially other African Americans and people who may have been alive at that time or there. And I try to have sort of have a set of ethics and morality to that kind of things. I will never do an image of a lynching. To me, that I don't need to do that. I don't think people shouldn't be able to see those images, but I don't think I'm not interested in making people see those images. I don't really want to shock people into listening to what I have to say through the work outside of text. I mean, sometimes the text can be shocking, but I do my best to not be brutal. When I was doing the work on the Washington College, I found an image from 1930s of, like, I did 2 pieces with blackface, but I found these images of children in blackface at Washington College, like it was some event on the college's lawn, and these like grade school age kids in blackface, and it was Diane Arbus, but even darker, and it was. I was like, I'm not using these because it just made you feel uncomfortable. It's like, it's not to say that the work that I do doesn't make people feel uncomfortable, but you have to find a balance. And so I really try to be mindful of that and have some ethics to it. But they're my ethics.
So do you, and Noah's also a fine answer, do you have any, do you have opinions on maybe work that you have seen that has included, you know, things that might bring more shock value, or you know, things that might be viewed as disturbing under the guise of, well, you know, this is history, people need to see this.
Mm-hmm. So the point that you made there, that's a common point. It's like, well, this is history, people need to see this, or this is so horrible that people need to see it. The thought that I point out is people saw photos of lynchings, they saw kids getting shot by fire hoses, and that can contribute to the civil rights era, or to the Civil Rights Act and that level of change. But it didn't do everything, and to me, often what that can do also is desensitize people. If you believe in something, and you see the thing that you believe in, or the system you believe in, doing horrible things, you can change, or you can let it desensitize you. And I think often it desensitizes people. And so I try to avoid that. Like, I don't want to make people have to make this sort of moral and ethical knee-jerk reaction when they see the work. I want them to think about it. I want to ease them into it to a point. Like, sometimes I don't want to handhold people, but yeah. So as far as other artists that have done stuff, I mean, I guess particularly was several years ago at the Whitney Biennial, I'm forgetting the artist's name, but this white artist did the painting of Emmett Till's open casket. And I think that was really awful. I think that it was unnecessary. I don't know what the point she was trying to make. I mean, I know what she said, but it showed to me as a white person who wanted to show support and acknowledge the gruesome history, but not understanding how to do that, but essentially having that sort of white self-assuredness that she was doing the right thing. It was bad, and that really bothered me. So stuff like that. Like, personally, like, stuff like that, I don't know if it really does the work. It certainly doesn't do the work that I'm trying to do.
So speaking of doing the work, one of the most powerful aspects of your work, and really the catalyst behind the theme of this program here, is how you constantly are bringing attention to and naming the perpetrators of this anti-Black, white supremacist violence and policy, and so can you talk a little bit about the power that you find in naming those perpetrators in a way that is very, very direct, not, you know, just this sort of abstract thinking that we see a lot in image making and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to me trying to better like the fundamental part of my practice, trying to better contextualize things. When we think of the civil rights movement, we talk about the things Black people did, but we don't enough talk about why very specifically did they have to do them. So to me, it's important to acknowledge what people thought then, what people with power specifically thought then. I guess I didn't get too specific in the talk or in my presentation about that, but like 2 of the pieces that I did in the Washington College are the work about the college's history in Kent counties was With the college's history, I did a piece about William Rivers. He was in there, but it was when I was referencing just the frame. He was the 13th president of Washington College, so this is the 1870s, 73 when he started. He's from Charleston, South Carolina. He taught at the University of South Carolina. During Reconstruction in the early 70s, when the federal government has occupied South Carolina, its government is integrated. There are black and white people in the government at the time. Specifically, the Secretary of State, who was, I think, a quarter black. The articles I was reading, people said he could pass as white, but he was an abolitionist, was born into slavery. His father was his owner and had freed him and sent him to school. So he was the Secretary of State of South Carolina in the 1870s, and he wanted to go to medical school. So the board, which was integrated of black and white men, let him in. He's the only black student at the school, so 3 professors resigned, and one of them was William Rivers, and he became the president of Washington College. He went on 3 years later in 1876. He's one of the founders of South Carolina's Historical Society, which is still, of course, exists. They had their first meeting since the Civil War. He gives this long speech, and in the work I quote it, where he's basically vehemently saying that American rights are just for white men and that they are specifically not for women or black people. And that needs to be said, that needs to be acknowledged. I did a sort of a piece that's not kind of like a sibling piece to that, is about George Vickers, who is a US Senator, but lived his whole life in Chestertown, graduate of Washington College, was a unionist. He had an administrative role in the Union Army. There's a lot of letters that he sent to Lincoln complaining about black recruitment during the Civil War, but he was a slave owner and he was a vehement white supremacist. After the Civil War, he debated in the Senate against all the Reconstruction amendments, so the right to black men to vote, the right to equal rights, all of those things. And so I acknowledge that in that work. But so yeah, it's really important that we talk about the institutions and the people that were allowing these things. I'll give another example, sort of an institutional example of, and this is, I guess when I've talked about this before, it's like when people talk about reparations, one of the points that I make is that you don't have to even talk about slavery to talk about reparations. You can stay in the 20th century. In the 1930s, the federal government created a loan program to stimulate the economy and the middle class to allow people to get home loans with low or no interest on the loans. In the time period, so it was the early 1930s to the early 1960s where that program existed, it was around $120 billion is what the government gave. Less than 1% went to non-white families. It's everybody's tax dollars, but it was only essentially going to white people. The GI Bill, it was designed to be distributed locally, which was orchestrated by Southern senators so that they could decide whether or not how they were going to give it to black people. If you came back from World War II and you wanted to go to college, the GI Bill should pay for that. Now, they might give it to you, but in the South there are only so many HBCUs. If those schools are full, you can't go to college, and you can't do anything. So a lot of veterans didn't get access to college in other ways of benefit. So those are the type of things that I really try to acknowledge in the work, like why there was protest, why the black community and activists needed to do what they're doing.
One of my last questions. So as your role as an artist and I know you haven't taken on the title of historian, but someone who is I don't know. I'll just say a history buff to keep it light. One of the powers that that artists and image makers have is to reimagine. So again, speaking kind of to this title. But I would love to hear from you the role and value that you believe artists and just image makers in general have when it comes to contextualizing, recontextualizing, exposing history to the masses?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's sort of what you ended on is that's the thing. Most historians aren't good visually. And so the reason why I don't like to be called a historian, one, is because I know the work that historians do, and I don't do that work, and I think it would undermine the work that they do. But also, there's a big difference between a public historian and a historian. And I've learned that at Washington College, working with a lot of public historians. Most historians are making work for other historians, and it's not, like, I've read some books and I've read articles by historians, and I'm like, this is so important. This is, to me, groundbreaking and really helps us understand where we're at. And if you show this to an average person, they're not going to understand any of it, because you have to have read this, and this before you understand it. And it's not contextualized well. And so that's a real fundamental part of it. Is it helps a better contextualization. I mean, I guess when I think about this kind of thing, I'm really thinking about what I'm going to do. I feel like it would be overwhelmed if I'm thinking about what other artists are going to do. But for me, it is contextualizing things that to help people better understand them. I think doing the thing on a visual, making these visual things helps people. I mean, people like looking at visual things, like things that appeal to them. And I'm using that to sort of lead them into understanding this history. Now, you could do that in a million different ways, and this goes back to what I was talking about earlier. You should do what you love, and what I love doing this. I'm going to do it anyway. So it makes it easier to, or I guess that's how I came to the conclusion that that's how I'm going to do this work. But I do think when you present things in a visual way, it helps people understand them better. At least that's what my goal is. And even if you don't get all of it, you might go home now and read more about Gloria Richardson, or about Chestertown. That's sort of the goal that I'm going for, and I hope that that's a better way of getting this history and this information to people.
So the last question from me. So with everyone that is sitting in this room, what are some tactics, what are some strategies that you believe we could all walk away with in order to take what we've learned here today, but then also be able to kind of what you just said, as far as maybe doing your own research, et cetera. But what are some things that we can all do to play a small part in researching, kind of contextualizing, and then maybe even disseminating important historical information to those who would benefit from it?
That's a hard question. I guess the quickest, not the best answer is just read history, which is hard. But when I started trying to do this, it was a lot harder, and I'm just talking about reading history. One of the things I saw was like, well, how do I know I'm getting the right book? Like, what if, and it actually, I mean, I think because it sounded like a compliment, one of the best advice I got was from a historian. Her name's Megan Kate Nelson, and she's sort of 19th century historian. She said, you just trust yourself, think critically of the book, think about what you already know, think about what you've learned in other things, and you'll figure it out. And I was like, okay, I trust that that's true. And it is true, especially the more you read. I've gotten part of the way through books and be like, no, this is not, something's up, and then go see reviews and see other scholars reviewing it and be like, okay. So that part's hard, but it is just really pouring into these things. And that's the hard thing, not everybody wants to pour into history. So that's the struggle. And so I guess my answer is I don't have an answer to that.
It's a decent answer.
I think everybody that here, you have an interest in history. So I guess I encourage everybody here to just, if there's a time period that you're interested in, there's so many books about it. You should start somewhere and read about it and learn about it. And for me, I guess what sticks to me is like, I can't expect everybody to do that. And I want to be a resource to people who aren't going to do that. And give them, or at least send them out the right direction. Like, give them a little bit so they have like a little bit of a compass on knowing where to go next. But yeah, it's a hard thing to do. It's a hard thing to history, and going to the thing that I made the point in this presentation about not knowing history is bad, and it makes things harder. And I think that in this, it makes things harder for us, but it also benefits institutions and certain people. And I think those institutions and certain people often can go out of their way to make sure we don't know our history. I want to give an example, but there's such a, when you think about lost cause propaganda and just the nonsense of the Civil War era, if you see people who sympathize with, again, Robert E. Lee, people will say he hated slavery and he wasn't really a slave owner. But it was the opposite of that. It was the direct, it's not just that he was a slave owner. He never enslaved people by purchasing them, but he inherited his wife's father's land, which is now Arlington National Cemetery. But in his father-in-law's will, he said, I promised these people I would manumit them. You should manumit them, at some certain time, and Lee said, "Well, if I do that, then I can't afford the debts I'm taking on. I can't keep this plantation going, so I don't want to do this." But it was a will. Now, granted, this is during the Civil War, so Virginia is, or at least it goes into so Virginia is part of the Confederacy at this point. Couldn't be more pro-slavery. It's a country founded on slavery. He wants to break this will and say, keep these enslaved people. The Virginia Supreme Court doesn't let him do it. They're saying like, no, you have to stick to this will. You have to manumit these people. So it just boggles my mind that this man who went to the state Supreme Court to keep the people he was enslaving. Fast forward to today, where you have people talking about the lost cause and insist that he didn't believe in slavery. I mean, that's the trick. That's the tool that keeps people ignorant of these things and stops us from learning. So my goal is to make work about Robert E. Lee and specifically have the court documents saying, hey, he was trying to keep these people he enslaved. Like, that's what I try to bring to people.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. Do we have any time for any Q&A? Or okay, I know our time's kind of thing. Does anyone out here have any questions at all?
Thank you. Do you receive pushback for doing your work?
No. So, I mean, I have people, so the only time I really have gotten pushback goes back to that flag project. When I was doing that flag project, I got interviewed by the Washington Post. And so they interviewed me talking about state flags that still have connections to Confederacy. And I got two kinds of pushback. One was from flag enthusiasts and being mad at me for using the wrong terminology, that was more funny. But I did get one, so I got one email from a guy who was so angry at me reading it, I've gotten really mad, certainly with internet comments of people saying racist stuff or sticking to these and refuting what's true. This one actually didn't really make me that angry because I could tell he was mad about something else. He just went on this like sort of stream of consciousness talking about how it read like, not to compare myself to King, but it read like the angry hate mail King got, where it was like, I don't think this specific thing is what you're really mad about. Whether it's a broader thing in your anger, you don't understand what's happening, or it's a personal thing. But that was weird. But then you get comments, especially when it's like reaches a broader audience, like this Washington Post article. And that's really, but again, most of the time I haven't really gotten strong pushback. one of the weird things is in that article, I talk about Maryland's flag. Maryland's flag has connections to Confederacy. It's very conceptual. I mean, the flag is basically the Calvert family seal. But the point I make is, unlike the Confederate flag, the Maryland's flag is loved by everybody. And it doesn't mean, like, the Confederate connection is that during the Civil War, the red and white portions of the flag were used by the Confederate Marylander soldiers. The red, or the black and the yellow, were used by Unionists. So conceptually, in the early 20th century, when the state adopted the flag, they said, this is a symbol of bringing back, like, reconciliation. But really, they were just talking about white people, because they weren't really considering the black Marylanders. So that's that connection, but it's just conceptual. So I say the governor should just say, acknowledge that past, and say, but it's very clear that flag, Maryland's flag, doesn't mean that anymore. Everybody in Maryland loves this flag. It brings everybody in the state together. Let's just acknowledge that. I would get comments, people saying, you're never going to get rid of Maryland's flag. I was like, yeah, I don't want to. Like it's just, so there's stuff like that. But I guess I've been lucky. I know other people that get awful hate mail stuff, but no, I haven't had pushback.
The other question is, how do you deal with mental health? I heard you mention being intentional about how you place trauma in your work, and just even as you didn't share certain clips, knowing that certain people in space.
Take breaks. Like I've you know, one of the best books I've ever written is "The Half Has Never Been Told" by Ed Baptist, and it's about the system of slavery in the 19th century, but he really focuses on the capitalism side of it. But it's very good because he really humanizes African Americans. And through that humanization, he talks about the suffering of African Americans. And there's this point in the book about halfway through where he talks about there's documentation of this woman who was like a teenager, actually, I think, who was sold south. I think she was from one of the upper slave states, and was devastated. She's no longer with her family. She doesn't know. And a woman asked her what her name was, an enslaved woman. She said nobody, because that's how she felt. And I was like, I put the book down for a while. Like, you really have to just be self-aware of what you're bringing in, especially with social media, like with the traumatic things we see in that way. Like, I don't say don't watch it, but be mindful of, like, ask yourself how it's making you feel, and ask yourself, maybe today I don't look at that stuff, because it will. And to me, one of the biggest things that scares me about that is I'll get so angry and so emotional about it, the work will suffer, where I'll be missing. I won't be contextualizing things as well because I'm so angry. That's really important. So that's kind of how I think about it. The Half Has Never Been Told. I cannot recommend it enough. It's so good.
First, before I ask my question, I want to say brilliant presentation, and I like
Thank you.
that you connected the past to the present, which is something that I try to do all the time with my students when I teach. In that same vein, and I want to go back to Robert E. Lee. When I was getting dressed this morning, getting ready to come here, I saw a news report. One of the Virginia public school districts, the school board voted 5-1 that a school whose name had been changed from Robert E. Lee and something else, they'll go back to it. And then there was an elementary school that is being renamed after the name was changed during 2018 and everything that happened during 2020 back to, I think it was a Confederate general and a colonel. The high school was definitely being renamed back to Robert E. Lee something. In your mind, you know, and again, I'm going back to what you were saying earlier, what do you think is happening right now?
I think it's shocking and scary, but I think it's important that we remember that social change is not linear, and that things can get better and get worse and go back and forth, and I think that's what's happening. I mean, I remember when Trump won the election, I was like, oh, this is the chilling thought I got, like literally right when I saw it happen was, oh, Obama was Reconstruction.
Yes.
And this is, And 2016 is 1877, when the South was returned to the white power structure, and that's how I felt with Trump. And then you see I didn't put it in this, but we see at the event at Ole Miss with the protests, there was a undergrad who was wearing red, white, and blue overalls and is in a black girl's face making monkey noises. And it's just like, that's exactly what was happening in the 60s. And so, and what that gets to is me, it's like, so I hope people realize that things have not changed the way that we think they've changed. They have, of course, changed. But it's like that old thing Malcolm X said, don't stab me in the back 6 inches and pull it out 3 and tell me their progress was made. I think that we really have to think about things that way. And again, it is like, you can go back in history where it's like from the early 1860s up into 1877 in the South, there are so many examples of flourishing black communities because the federal government was in control. You can go back even to early colonial times. There are accounts of early colonies who introduced themselves to these Native Americans, acknowledged their intelligence, their ingenuity, and said, like, literally wrote down saying, we're really good at this, they're really good at that, we should all work together and create this great community. Like, those things were attempted and happened 400 or 500 years ago. So there is a repeating thing. I think that we, again, learning about these histories, understanding what specifically is repeating, I think is what will help us sort of get through it. If that answers the question, yeah.
Any other? Oh.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So continue the work that you're doing and be mindful, even though you may not consider yourself a historian, at a minimum you are a purveyor of information. And that is what, from my perspective, I'm from a West Indian background, and the way I understand things, I know you may be fearful of showing the image of an individual being hung, but from my standpoint, where I do stuff, unfortunately, we have hung one individual, but the rules and records and laws nowadays hang an entire generation. And the hanging is fundamental.
Oh, absolutely.
Because we have gotten to a point that stuff is spoon-fed. And if you don't go and search, like I said, I'm 58, never heard of this one.
Yeah. So I think I should make a point that, and I think my partner Megan here can attest to it. I don't have a shortage of self-assuredness. I do have a level, like, I know the work that I'm doing is good, and I'm not humble about it. The main reason why don't call myself a historian isn't because I don't think I'm doing just as important of work as them. It's because I'm not doing the same work as them. There are parts of what they do that I think takes a lot of work and skill that I don't do and I don't know how to do. And being a history-based artist, to me, is a title. It's a good enough title. So it's not me not wanting to be called a historian is not from being humble.
So, Kim, are we moving into the? Okay. Thank you all for your questions.
Yeah, let's give Jason and Thomas a round of applause. That was really great. So many things that I can reiterate or echo off of, but I just really learned a lot, Jason, and even in planning this with you, but now, seeing it in its implementation phase, I'm so happy that we did this. But we are not done. What we're going to do right now is take an intermission and allow folks to freshen up, use the restroom. We have some refreshments right outside on the landing that we're going to ask you to grab and bring back with you. And we have some really fun parts to the rest of this program. We're going to kind of collaborate and come together more, and we're going to hear from some more special guests that we have here with us as well. But before I do that, of course, I wanted to thank some other folks in the room. One, I wanted to recognize the BDM staff. We have Shelly, who is our Chief Financial Officer, Ms. Taja, who is our Marketing Coordinator, Bria, who is our fabulous intern. We have Abiola, he walks in right on time. He walked in right on time. Abiola, our Education Coordinator. Jan, who is our Marketing Director. We like to call them the Supreme Dream Team. Really just helping. Yes, you could give them a round of applause, please. And then, of course, to thank our sponsors. This event and a lot of our programs cannot happen without our sponsors. So Arts in Public Places, the Banneker-Douglass Foundation, and then, of course, I spoke about the Maryland Commission on African American History and Culture earlier, but the commission is the commission that oversees the museum. So I wanted to mention them again. And again, please feel free to grab some refreshments, freshen up, and you all can come right back on in here when you're done. Thank you.
Some of you brought objects that have personal significance but are inherently historical objects, and we're going to talk about them. I think because we have kind of an intimate number of you, after we do our thing up here, we'll pass the mic around, and if you would like to share, we really hope you do, what your item is, and you can talk and say what it means to you, and we can kind of talk about it in a historical context. Or I'll try to lead in sort of framing things that way, because really, you can tell history through things, through objects, and that's what we're going to do here. So, as you've been probably watching, the film behind me there's two recordings in this footage. One, what we're looking at now, is the footage I took these two stills from the Chestertown protests in 1962. The second half, in which nationally very special, I mean they both are, but what's really special is the other one, if you couldn't tell by watching it, is footage from the March on Washington in 1963, color footage of it, which is really interesting, particularly too because it's just footage of people walking around and not the dramatic scenes of the speeches on at the Lincoln Memorial. How we came across this is through, well, I should say the person who recorded it is Vaughn Conway, who was a Washington College graduate, who is from from Annapolis, and was active in civil rights work in Chestertown. And we're so lucky to have his son, Carl, who donated this video to the Chesapeake Heartland, who digitized it. And Vaughn's good friend, Leslie Raymond. So I'm going to tell you, before we start talking about, well, basically what they're doing is they're going to treat this film like their brought artifact. I'll tell you about both of them. So I've known Leslie since I've been here. Leslie and her husband Vince were sort of the patron saints of arts in Kent County, Maryland. They were the first directors of the Kent County Arts Council, which is now the Kent Cultural Alliance. As you may know, every county in Maryland have arts councils, and they sort of led the first one. Or they were the first to lead the one in Kent County. Leslie came here from Phoenix, Arizona in 1960 to study at Washington College, and during her time there was involved in the local activism in the early 60s. Leslie was at this event, and she's going to talk to us about that some. Other works that Leslie has done in Kent County, and I can speak from this from personal experience. Like I mentioned, her and her husband really were essentially the founders of the art scene in Kent County. And if you've been to Kent County, the art scene is amazing. I'm really grateful that I get to be there. Leslie also was very instrumental in refurbishing and virtually rebuilding Sumner Hall. Sumner Hall is what's essentially an African-American Civil War veteran meeting house. It's now a museum and a meeting house for the community in Kent County. It's the only functioning meeting house of African-American Civil War veterans in the United States. Interestingly enough, there is one near my hometown in Illinois, in Danville. It isn't. I don't think you could call it standing, but there are still remnants of that building. But Leslie's been very involved in the arts and in social justice work in Kent County since she's been here since 1960. So we're really happy to have her here. Next, we have Carl. And Carl, I just I met him at the opening of this show, and I'm really grateful, so I have notes. Carl is also from Annapolis. He is also a graduate of Washington College. He graduated in 1985, which is a year after I was born. He worked for Xerox after college in Washington, D.C., but it seems like he didn't really like it. But then went to Japan to teach English and did so here in Maryland for 7 years. Carl has been for 27 years has been working as a carpenter in the Annapolis area. And like I mentioned, Carl is the son of Vaughn, who recorded this film. So we're so grateful that he brought this to us at the Star Center at Washington College and the Chesapeake Heartland program that digitized this. So they're going to talk a little bit about what this means as an artifact, particularly Leslie, her experience at this event. So I guess I'll start with Carl. Why don't you just tell us about your dad and about him recording this? I also should mention, and maybe you can expand on this, Vaughn, Carl's father, was actually a part of founding and was on the original board of the Banneker-Douglass Museum, which is really awesome. I mean, it's just full circle here. But yeah, could you just tell us about the film? Tell us a little bit about your dad and how this got digitized.
First off, let me say that this is the first time I've ever had to stand or sit in front of a group of people and speak, so please forgive me. I was born in 1963, so the actual filming I don't know much about. I discovered both of these films after my father had passed away, so I didn't even get a chance to really talk to him about it. He got interested in making movies and taking pictures when he was in the service over in Germany during the Cold War. And so when he came back to the United States in '56, late '56, I guess it was, he brought his equipment back, he ended up at Chestertown at Washington College. And his background, he was a great dad. So I was excited when I found the films because I knew, one, he was friends with Leslie, and I've known Leslie all my life. And I knew that some of the stuff was from Chestertown. I recognized some of my father's friends in the March on Washington film. So I approached Leslie, I think after, at a celebration of life for my father, and mentioned that I had this. And then we kept going around, and finally I got it over to her at Chestertown.
Cool. So. That's wonderful. So Leslie, you were there.
I indeed was there.
Yeah,
it was a snowy day.
Yeah.
You can see some snow. The dogs were sort of snarling. If you could see the police standing by, expecting the worst. We all gathered, and the people you see in the group gathered around the front of the restaurant at the time, Bud Hubbard's restaurant. It was completely famous for being really segregated, as almost everything in Chestertown was at the time. Especially the restaurants, the movie theater, the schools, of course, were segregated until 1968 in Chestertown. So I had arrived in 1960 on a bus, coming to Washington College, thrilled to see the beautiful Eastern Shore, but really I was pretty taken aback by the culture of the segregated culture. I hadn't experienced that in the West. So I was kind of looking around, and you know, I wasn't an avid activist because I didn't know how to do that at that point. But we started to really tune into the whole concept of the Freedom Riders, the buses arriving with protesters. In the film, I think you see sort of an old green bus, and that had brought in a bunch of protesters who you see in the picket line holding the signs. There was a pretty incredible movement in Chestertown and throughout the Eastern Shore, especially through the black churches, to welcome these protesters who would come into the town, and usually, just like we've just been fed this beautiful lunch, they would be fed and sort of embraced and then go out and do the picketing. So we were paying attention to all that. And some people didn't really know what to make of it. One of the things that was also happening elsewhere, of course, were the sit-ins. And they go, okay, are they going to have a sit-in in Chestertown? Well, where are they going to sit? They had two places that had 3 stools each, the Dairy Queen and one of the soda fountains at a drugstore. In shock and awe and worrying about there might be a sit-in, those 3 stools were taken out of the out of the drugstore, taken out of the Dairy Queen, so they couldn't be a sit-in. So it was like semi-ineffective movements. There wasn't a lot of, there was a threat of violence, but there wasn't, especially in this exhibit of getting to see what was actually happening. It was a peaceful protest, but it was very significant. And as I said, some of us were, from just all friends. We were friends of Van who had the movie camera, and we all would go and be just part of a spectator, and as well as, so I think the people you see in the group are more spectators. They're not there to be violently opposed to anything. They're just like, well, what's going to happen next? So I think that is the vibe you get when you see this particular film. And so I was proud to have been part of it. Then we sort of lost track of the footage. As Carl said, he didn't know anything about it, but I always remember the footage. And as things heated up in all of these activities, I kept thinking about, where is that film? Where is that film? Well, they found it, and now we all get to see it. So that's our artifact, and we appreciate that.
Before I open it up to letting other people join in and talk about the artifacts they may have brought, I have one question for you. So when you guys were watching my talk, I mentioned the first 3 African-American graduates. The first woman to graduate was Patricia Godbolt. And I know that you've told me in the past that you were friends with her. Could you tell us a little bit about your friendship with her and like what it was like from your perspective for her going to Washington College and living in Chestertown?
I dropped the mic too soon. Pat Godbolt was a good friend. We lived on the same floor in the dormitories. We did some of the activities, some sports activities together. And at one point, we all wanted to go to the movies. So we all went down together to the theater in the middle of Chestertown. And really, this was the biggest surprise I'd ever had. We all went in to go to the movies, and she was directed to a different door, a different set of steps, up into the balcony where the African Americans were made to sit because they weren't allowed to sit downstairs. And yeah, it was not only a different lobby, it was a completely different door, and it was these little separate stairs. And it wasn't just the balcony, it was the back of the balcony, because the balcony, front part of the balcony had sort of the same kind of seats as downstairs. The back of the balcony just had those wooden seats, like an old high school or something. So Pat went into the designated door, and me and the 2 or 3 other friends went in our assigned door, and then we hiked upstairs, and we all sat together. And it was just an event that cemented the concept for me, because as I said, it came from elsewhere. I'd never dreamed I would be in that situation. But later, she told us stories, and I was proud to have been part of her activism, which came from that.
Great, thank you for telling us that. Does anybody have any questions for Carl or Leslie? All right, well, now let's open it up to you all. Did anybody bring an artifact that they would like to share? Okay.
Hello, everyone. So I did bring an artifact. I was so excited about this. I hope you all are as excited as I am, and if not, that's fine too. So what I have here, what do you all see? You all see a book, right? Story time. So in 1967, my mom, who is from Harlem, New York, born and raised, her best friend actually at the time was looking to get liberated from her family for whatever reason. And she actually took her family to court, and she won and was able to be liberated. She was able to live on her own. She was 17. The state paid for an apartment, subsidized food, and everything. So one of the teachers in their high school lived in a brownstone in Harlem. I'll give you all a hint. It was on 127th or 128th between 5th and Madison. I don't know if that means anything to you just yet. But so he told my mom's friend about this apartment. They went over and met the owner of the brownstone, Mr. Harper. Mr. Harper's nephew had just passed away. And they told my mom, again, my mom was 16, turning 17. Her best friend was 17. They were looking for a space to smoke reefer, actually, or weed, as we call it now. And they found it. They found it in this kitchenette in this brownstone. Mr. Harper told them there was still some remnants from the previous owner. Feel free to go through. If you find anything, keep it. If not, just throw it away. So again, you know, they had a place where they could smoke their reefer. And my mom, she was somewhat of an activist and enthusiast. They start going through the things, and they go and ask Mr. Harper, well, Mr. Harper, who was your nephew? And who do you all think it was? It was Langston Hughes. My aunt moved into the kitchenette that was previously owned by Langston Hughes. This was where he lived when he passed away. And I asked my mom, I was like, that's so sad, it was a kitchenette. Langston Hughes, you know, passed away, but it wasn't that. It was a brownstone, as you can imagine, in Harlem. And this now is a historical site, but it was a family home. Like, the entire family lived there. So, and my mom said the setup was very nice, very beautiful. But anyway, my mom did keep this book. I said, did you steal it? She was like, no. I didn't steal it. She was like, Mr. Harper told us that we could have the book. So this book is called, and I mean, as you can see, it's in really bad shape. This was Langston Hughes's book, and when my mom got it, it was in much better shape, but then she went on to give it to my father, who was also a poet, and he just had no, I don't know. Well, we could see how he felt about the book. But inside, so this book is called The Poetry of the Negro, which was edited by Langston Hughes and another woman, and I'm sorry, her name escapes me. But it's a compilation of black poets. And in it, there are people like Gwendolyn Brooks and others, but they actually, in the book, there's handwritten acknowledgments to Langston from the poets in the book. So this is my artifact. So my mom told me, when she gave it to me on my 40th birthday, she said, there's no one else I could have thought of to have it but you. I was like, but you gave it to my father before me. It was like, I was the only person at this point who, like, she couldn't find anybody else to give it to, basically. So now it's mine. It's my artifact, and it was once owned by Langston Hughes. And I'll pass it down in my family as well, unless anybody wants to buy it.
That's wonderful. That's really wonderful. That's impressive. That's a lot of history right there. You should digitize it. Yeah. So one thing I should say before somebody goes next, you don't have to do such a grand and amazing presentation. You can even stay seated. We'll just bring you a mic. But does anybody else have something they'd like to share and show? Oh. That's wonderful. I think that's wonderful. And one of the things that I love to learn about is when you can really humanize those historic figures, especially when they're, you know somebody that knew them. At the Star Center and with the Chesapeake Heartland, there are two women who are older and were born and raised in Kent County, who are like public historians. It's Carolyn Brooks and Arilee Ringgold Johnson. And Carolyn, when I was talking about this work, and she was like, "Oh, I knew Gloria Richardson," and I was like, "Oh, cool! Like, what's the story?" She's like that family and her family knew each other, and she was like, I really did not like her daughter. And that was the story. But to me, that's funny. But to me, what was so funny about that is talking about this profound figure, this person who, is a foundation of the Black Power movement. And she's just telling me how, she was kind of annoyed by her daughter. And I was like, that's special. That's cool. Well, it must have been Carolyn. It must have been Carolyn then. Yeah.
So I brought an artifact. Before I think it, I'll stay seated. So I'm a huge proponent of meeting people where they are. That's part of the reason why this exhibition is designed in the fashion that it is designed, because it's meant to remind people of home, of interior space, a space to be vulnerable, a space to remember the past, be able to sit and imagine about the future while being in the present, if you will. And so something that I brought is, this is actually, here, I'll bring it out now. It's a shirt. Hold on, it's a shirt that was a gift from my father, who's here, actually, back there. And so this was given to me, and obviously it commemorates the Negro Leagues. And on the back, it has a list of the different teams. And actually, the shirt came in better condition, but I loved it so much. I mean, I've worn this like 100 times. And it wasn't until fairly recently that I was like, you know what, I'm going to stop wearing this. And at some point, I'm going to frame it. But it's special to me. This is an example of something that's special to me because, and when I think about meeting people where they are, when I received this shirt as a gift, I was young. This was probably at least, I'm 30 now, so over 10 plus years ago. And at the time, I was just a young guy who was, just in on a journey of self-discovery. I'm learning about history. I'm getting excited about really just about this journey, and I was always a fan of fashion as a way of self-expression and whatnot. And so being able to have a shirt that I felt like connected a lot of the dots, because I'm a fan of athletics and things like that, but also being able to learn more about the Negro Leagues and things like this was able to to open up my interest. I was able to find books about it and learn about just different accounts of Negro League players and just a lot of these things that I wasn't exposed to as a young kid because the Negro Leagues no longer exist. But I like it because it was just a gateway. It was just a small, well, I mean, it's not really small. It's kind of a big shirt, but it's an object that just that allowed me to embrace this time period that I became passionate about. And just allowed me to just continue to explore my interests in this and be able to have a sense of pride and being seen and again and hopefully, and I also believe that if people see especially with fashion. You know, if someone was to see me wearing this shirt and they didn't know what the Negro League was, or they didn't think about it in depth or anything, that could also be a gateway. Yeah, so that's my artifact. Oh, and I think this came from the. I think this came from the museum, which I think is in Ohio, Kansas City. Okay.
Anybody else have anything they want to share? All right.
Did you bring something? Oh, okay. Do you want the microphone?
So, when he told me he was going into art, I was like, you know, I'm, like I said, 58 now, yes. I was like, look, you better be able to eat, because artists don't make money till they die. So I was like, he's got this curator stuff and he's doing that, but I did promise him that whatever he does, as long as I'm aware of it, whether it's in Maryland or whether it's in Mozambique, I will be there. So me and his mom separated years and stuff like that. As I was going through my struggle to stay connected to him, you know, you do your stuff, you got him the weekend, so on and so forth. So this is the, I wasn't sure. I was doing everything I could, but I wasn't sure if they, you know, were recognizing me and knowing that I was there, knowing that their dad was there. So, you know, we got him on the weekend, blah, blah, blah. And the first Father's Day that we had, separated. Amazing, because like, you know, okay, you got him for Father's Day, you got him that weekend, stuff like that. And he's like, hey, Dad. You know, and at that time I had, but I still got it, I'd like John Starks. And he got me the box, and inside the box, John Starks card. And I remember the feeling, the work, even though we're separated, the work I'm putting in, being recognized. So it's just funny that he brought an article that I gave him, and he gave me, you know. So, and you know, so that's and that is why I spoke to you that you're doing, just to get back to that. That, and you say you really didn't discount yourself, so on and so forth, but the work that you're doing, like I said today, I know it's Richardson. If I didn't come because of him, to support him, I wouldn't be here to support you indirectly, and then you being the historian that you are, is purveying knowledge to individuals that is at least close to twice your age. But, you know, so thank you, and thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share? Anybody? All right, I have one. So, and I actually always have it. This is a really personal thing about my own personal history. So this is a rifle shell that was shot at my grandfather's funeral. So he passed away in 2010, and he got the salute and the firing because he was a World War II veteran. So my memory, I shouldn't say memory, I mean, it was 2010 when he passed away. But I guess I didn't really get to know, I didn't get to know him as an adult. But I have a lot of vivid memories of visiting with my grandparents when I was a kid. Specifically, those were the earliest memories I can think of where I thought about race. So my mother's side of the family is white, mostly German descent. My grandfather was second generation German American. His grandparents on both sides immigrated to the United States. And I grew up in, like I mentioned in my talk, I grew up in Champaign and Urbana, Illinois. It's a twin city. My grandparents lived out in a small town outside of that called Monticello, Illinois, which is a mispronunciation of Monticello. But I remember very young, early grade school ages, and understanding that me and my brother were the only black kids around and being worried. But the way that my grandparents treated me was good, and it made me feel safe in that area. But it also, I think what it did is it gave me space of where I wasn't scared. I just got curious about it, and like, why are these things different, and why do people treat us differently? My grandfather, he was an engineer. My grandparents' love story is a little obnoxious. My grandfather's 18th birthday was the day after Pearl Harbor. So he was planning on going to engineering school. He didn't. He enlisted. He enlisted in the Corps of Engineers. And when he was in the military and before he went to Europe, he was stationed at a base in near Lexington, Kentucky. There was a dance for the GIs and the girls at a nursing school. My grandmother is from Versailles, Kentucky, which is also a mispronunciation of a European town, which is outside of Lexington. And she was a nursing student. And so they met there at this Valentine's Day dance and corresponded through the war, stayed together after the war, and eventually got married. My grandfather's from Berwyn, Illinois, which is, it's one of those suburbs like connected to the city. When he was growing up, it wasn't really a suburb, of more a neighborhood in Chicago. They ended up there. They lived in Brookfield, had my mother and her 3 siblings. He got a job at the Kraft Foods plant as an engineer there, which is in Champaign, Illinois, and that's what brought them down. But I have this around because I do miss that I didn't get the chance to the last time I saw him was the first time I talked to him about World War II. And again, he was an engineer, he didn't fight. But he was at Normandy. They're still fighting, but he was actually just taken through Normandy to work. But it was just, I do wish I could have spent more time with him. I look like him, not surprisingly, but we look very similar. And so I see him in myself. So when he passed away and at the funeral, one of my cousins picked up all the shells and gave them to the cousins and some of my grandfather's children, my mother and my aunt, and my uncles. But it was just, I always carry this, unless I'm going on a plane. Not that this technically, it's not going to be spent, but I just don't want to freak anybody out. But yeah, this is my artifact. And I feel like if I wanted to make work about this, I would talk about being a biracial kid growing up in the 90s and what that was like for me in living where I lived, and it was and those kinds of things, and how close I am to that side, or should I say, when I was growing up, I was much closer to that side of the family than my father's side. But yeah, his name was Ed Schuler. All right, anybody else want to share a story or share an artifact or anything? Totally okay if we don't. All right.
Cool. All right. Well, then we will have Sabri, you want to close us out?
Well, first, thank you all. Let's give our panel a round of applause. Carl, Leslie, again, Jason and Thomas. When we do these programs, right, and I've been at the museum now since 2018, and I'm like, okay, it's 12 to 3. That's a long time. When we do the programs, they're so good, they just go by like so quickly. course, that goes into like how we do it. But this was really, really, really good. Like, I learned a lot. I was crying. Thanks, Dad. And, you know, I can't thank you all enough. Jason and Thomas, you all were unusually committed to the planning of this program. And I think that's what made it really great. Again, I want to thank our executive director for just continuously giving us this platform to do this type of work. She's so humble. Thank you so much to the team, and thank you for you all, you know, coming out, being a attentive audience and engaging with us. We really appreciate it, and we hope to see you. Our next program will be on June 1st, and that will be a closing program for after-school program we have taking place in the Robin Hood community of Annapolis. It's free and open to the public, and we hope that you all can join us then. So thank you, everyone.
I want to add one more thing before we go that I should have said when I started my talk. As they've been saying, the staff here has been unbelievable. It's not like the way that we pulled this off, the meetings that we had where we could just bounce ideas off. Like this part here where we're talking about the other, I can't remember whose idea that was. Because it was just, we all had these ideas. Somebody would have a small idea. It's been a really wonderful experience. And particularly what I've noticed is because you got a lot of new staff members here, and it's a new group, but the potential I can see in what they can do with this place has been really impressive, and I'm really grateful that I've gotten to be a part of this. So I can't say enough about that, and I can't say enough about Thomas. I met Thomas right before the pandemic. He asked me to be in a show at Creative Alliance, and I was like, sure, Baltimore, yeah, put me in it. Had some work in it. Come to the opening and look at the opening similar to this show and be like, wait a second, this is really good. And it's like, of course the artwork good, yeah, that's fine, but the way that it is curated was next level. And I remember thinking, okay, whenever Thomas wants me to be in something, I'm going to be in it. So, and that's still true. So I can't say more about how an impressive curator is. That's only 30, which is not where I was not. I wouldn't have been that good when I turned 40 this year, but the work that he's done is really impressive as an artist and as a community member, and I'm grateful I get to work with him.
Yes. And I also, thank you so much, Jason, because Martina Dodd, who is our new curator of collections and exhibits, who's not on site today, but was so instrumental in helping to put this together. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention her and thank her. And then our administrative manager, LaRon Herbert, who just helps to keep the lights on and so many other things. So they're not here today, but I wanted to go ahead and recognize them. And again, thank you all, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thanks.